everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Tanya, and I am the Web and Marketing Director for Analytic Design, powered by Mosaic Data Services. And today, Jason Bach, the President of ADMDS, Analytic Design powered by Mosaic Services, has joined us to help us better understand web hosting basics for better website performance. You should see a poll question appear. If you wouldn't mind taking a moment to answer, do you know if your website is being backed up on a daily basis? So welcome, Jason. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, how are you? Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you fine now.
Wonderful.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how long you've been doing this and what makes you a subject matter expert? I know, a long time.
Well, my name is Jason Bach, and I have owned and operated Mosaic Data Services since the year 2000, so almost 20 years. And in that time, it's changed quite a bit from primarily doing networking, getting internet installed in hotels, believe it or not. That's how we started, to managed services for a spell, and then data center for a spell, and ultimately into web design as WordPress came to power, I suppose you could say. We started focusing more on it as a platform and the hosting because we were already in the data centers and providing internet service. So it was a natural transition for our business, sort of away from the desktop and managed services to the data center when the cloud was coming out as well. And so now our focus is pretty much exclusively on things that happen in the data center, which in my mind is the cloud. If somebody says you're using the cloud, that means that you're in the data center somewhere. And often that is your hosting and your email, software applications like QuickBooks, or other things that you might use, Canva, or QuickBooks Online, things like that, which are supposedly cloud-based, are all in a data center somewhere. And we, frankly, provide a lot of those services to our customers as well, in addition to hosting. I know today's focus is on hosting, so I'll try and stay with that. But suffice it to say that I've been doing this quite a while, and have a lot of experience with sort of the ins and outs and ups and downs as it relates to hosting websites and software and other things. Yeah.
So when you say data center, I think that a lot of people don't exactly understand what a data center is. Would you mind just explaining for a moment what a data center is, or what it looks like in general, so people can envision a little bit more about where their website is being hosted?
Sure. Data centers vary quite a bit in their sophistication. Data centers, for the most part, are pretty boring, unless you're, sort of a computer geek. Then I suppose it's like, being in a candy store. But data centers, by and large, are very secure buildings that are purpose-built to provide very reliable power, very reliable environmentals. Heating, air conditioning, humidity controls, etc., and very reliable internet connectivity, internet service. Most data centers will have multiple avenues to their power sources, multiple generators in case both of those power sources go out, and multiple connections, or peering it's called, with internet services providers like Verizon or Comcast or Level 3. There are a whole variety of internet service providers, and most of them in bigger data centers will try and have a point of presence so that their customers and folks like Mosaic can get connected to their network efficiently. And now with the FiOS, for example, and other services that we have as residential users in our homes and apartment buildings, um, that connectivity, buildings are being lit up. So now the data centers are even being connected to buildings, and you can cross connect your, your cloud services with your, sort of internal services as well. And now, frankly, I mean, a whole nother conversation probably, but with the whole shift in, sort of thinking to a work from home mentality, the data center sort of becomes the hub for that, for that functionality. That's where everything sort of originates, and people connect their laptops to their, files in the cloud and phone systems and everything. So the data centers, that place where those things happen. And they're often very nondescript. I mean, you could drive right by a data center and not even realize that's what it is, because, and by design, that's the way it is. They try and keep a low profile. They're very secure. When you go in, you may have to go through multiple entrances with multiple badges and fingerprints and retina scans and other things just to gain access to your equipment. But that's good. That's a good thing, and it's by design, and that's what we work with.
Mm-hmm. I
That
must be a web geek. Yeah, no, it does. But I must be a web geek, because the first time that I saw the data center, I was amazed. Like, still, it's hard to envision it if you haven't seen it. But when your website is being hosted, it's inside of a data center. It's safe, and it's just it's in a very good place.
Yeah, I mean, things can happen. I mean, it's electronics, it's computers, and when nature rings the bell and hurricanes come through or other things happen, we try. The data center is built to resist those things. But there are incidents, and you see them in the news and hear about them, and we try and minimize that stuff. But when you walk into a data, and you're basically looking at rows and rows of computers. I'm sure, if you watch TV, you see it on TV and shows and things. And frankly, some of that is exaggerated for TV, the sake of TV, but it's similar, lots of computers, servers in stacks, in cabinets, and in cages, and things
Mm-hmm.
like that. So yeah, it's a neat thing to see for the first time. I mean, just imagine like any factory would be kind of neat to see, whether it's, furniture being built or pickles being made or whatever it might be.
For the first time, yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, hopefully everybody can visualize what the data center is a little bit better than they could before they jumped on this call.
Yeah.
What we're going to do is we're going to get started. We're going to move fairly quickly because we have a lot of different areas to cover, but we do take questions for the last 15 minutes, and we do encourage you to ask questions all the way through. And then during the last 15 minutes, I'll read the questions out for Jason to answer. And then if for whatever reason there's a private question, we will respond to that privately, or we will be happy to send you an email or give you a call after the webinar. So again, thank you so much for joining us today, and let's get started. Our agenda today, so we started with the introduction, and we're going to talk about shared hosting versus private hosting, and about how a good hosting company provides more than just hosting services. If you're not currently hosted with Mosaic, then you want to watch out for hosting company red flags. Media types and your website performance. So how your website performs as you're adding different media types to it. Your standard do-it-yourself versus your managed hosting plan. And then at the end, we'll cover Q&A. So
Awesome.
Let's get started.
Yeah.
I'm excited. Are you excited?
I'm always excited to talk about this. Yeah, I can talk all day about this. So you want me to just go, or how do you want to do it? Okay.
Yeah, just go.
Hopefully here, I mean, I'm hoping to just kind of educate people and give them a basic sense of what's what as it relates to hosting, because we often get calls from people that say my website is slow, therefore my hosting provider sucks. And while that may be true, it's not necessarily true. And so there are a lot of things that are just sort of assumed by virtue of one thing happening, cause and effect, that if this, then it must be that. And hopefully what I can do with this is not only dispel some of that and give folks a little bit better sense of what it means and what's happening behind the curtain, but also help them understand when it's time to, to make a change, because it's very easy to outgrow your environment. As your business grows or your needs grow, things change. And you'll see in some of the analogies that we use here to sort of demonstrate this, like, for example, a shared hosting being like an apartment building, where you have common area and common space that are shared amongst all of the folks in the building. um, you you can outgrow that, and oftentimes when that happens, it's very obvious. You have you're single, or newly married couple, and then you have kids, and you outgrow the space, and now you need a house. And private hosting is to shared hosting, sort of as a single family home is to living in an apartment or a condo, because it provides you with your own piece of space in the data center, in the server, that you can use completely for the benefit of your website or your digital billboard. So most companies don't necessarily need that much space. Depending on, there are many things that sort of factor into it. Shared hosting is typically where most small businesses especially will start and will remain indefinitely. And then if if the site expands, if a site goes from being somewhat static to being e-commerce oriented, or in some cases, even with our customers, where they go from having maybe 100 visitors a month to 100,000 or 10,000. There are those things factor in, and that's frankly why analytics is so important. But those things factor into what sort of presence and resources you need to support the load. And typically it's a good sign that you're running out of resources. When things start to slow down, it's not necessarily the hosting that's the problem, but that's certainly a sign of it. When you're getting a lot more traffic, when your site is expanding in its size. For example, if you go from 5 pages to 500, or 5 products to 500, there's storage, there's compute, and there's memory in any computer, even your home computer. You run out of memory, things start to run slow. You run out of storage, it starts to run slow. If your programs are conflicting with one another, your software isn't being updated, things will start to break down. And so when we say hosting is, more than just, hosting providers do more than just host your website, it's very true, because there are so many other things that affect the performance of your site. But in a nutshell, shared hosting and private hosting are essentially two places where people will start. Shared being on a single server, with common resources that everyone shares, and is protected, and the landlord, in this case the hosting company, manages that environment. And then the private hosting, where the landlord, there may still be someone like a hosting company involved in managing the infrastructure, the data center component of it, but by and large, there may be an engineer, someone that's running the server, or even the hosting company is running the server. But you have more real estate within which to work and more resources to use toward the benefit of the hosting, the application, if it's a website or an application software, whatever. So next slide.
Okay, I think,
As
well,
usual.
it does make sense, but I just have a quick question. So if I have a brand new website versus having, a website that's been around for quite some time, would there be an assumption that if I have a website that's been around for a while, that a private hosting would be a better fit for me? Or is it more based on just the needs of the site itself? It's not so much how long the site has been around.
Yeah, age doesn't really really have much to do with it, unfortunately. Age has to do with some things, especially as it relates to search engine visibility and things like that, because the longer your domain has been around, the more seniority it has, and therefore, Google and the search engines look on it differently. But in terms of the pure hosting component, age really doesn't have much to do with it. It has more to do with size and how things are put together
Mhm.
than anything else. Yeah, and traffic, volume, load. I mean, sometimes you could argue, I suppose, the older a site is, the better the audience is, but that's not necessarily true. You can't necessarily
Mhm.
say because I'm 10 years old, I'm going to have more traffic, because I've seen many cases where it's just the opposite. The older it gets, the worse it is. So, um, it just depends. It really depends on the situation and largely on what's going on with the site. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That makes total sense.
So here, I
So,
mean, oh, go
mhm.
ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so I mean, just talking about a good hosting company provides more than hosting services. Um, what types of services should a good hosting company provide?
Well, I think, there are a number of them, and I think there are 6 on here, and which are key. But a hosting, in a nutshell, a good hosting company should be looking out for your site, and that relates to the compute and the resources that are being provided. Many what I will call commodity hosting providers like GoDaddy and others will effectively set up a server and jam as many people into that boat or that apartment as they can, or the apartment building, I suppose, in this case. And obviously, the more people that are there, or the more sites that are there, the less resource there is for everyone to share, and the common area is more crowded, and therefore it's harder for things to work properly or well. So um, a good hosting company is not going to overload their building or their servers in this case. And at Mosaic, we make an effort to keep that from happening. And sometimes, and it's not just numbers too. You can have 100 sites on a server, and one of those sites should really be in private hosting, for example, and it's consuming all the resources. So some neighbors are louder than others. So you not only have to have the resources and try and manage the numbers, but you also have to look and see if some neighbors are being louder than the other neighbors, because they may need to move to a different part of the building or a different place altogether, because they're consuming too much of the resource. So in addition to just providing the hosting space, we're also looking at what that space is requires in terms of its compute and the memory and the storage, so that there's a good balance in that environment. Beyond that, as I mentioned earlier, websites have a lot of pieces going on, a lot of things going on. There are images, there's data, there's video, sometimes there's audio, sometimes there are all these different things that are happening in a typical website. And so the server has to be able to manage those things and make them work properly. So it's important that the server is being updated, that it's in a modern operating system, and that the operating system is being updated regularly, that the database engine is being updated regularly, the web server engine. These are things that the typical business owner wouldn't see necessarily. Some engineers and managed services, maybe they see that, and in DIY, that's sort of the line where you move out of the development hat and into the engineering hat. But for the most part, business owners and small business owners especially are going to be more worried about the structure of the site itself, and will manage that as a hosting company for them. Whereas some hosting companies will just sort of set it up, put you in it, and then you're on your own, whether the database is being updated or not, whether the operating system is being updated or not. You're just kind of on your own. And there are many times where Josh and I will go in and we'll see sites that are on OSs that are 10 years old, and databases that are out end of life, and and the person is complaining about their hosting being bad, but the fact of the matter is that it's bad, but it's not necessarily the hosting. It's all of it's the maintenance of the servers, and we'll touch on that a little bit. But that's why it's important for the host not to just set it up and forget about it, but actually pay attention. It's also important that the site is being maintained properly, right? The site itself, it needs to be managed. There are there are vulnerabilities that we hear about all the time, and if a site isn't being properly maintained, just the same as a server isn't being properly maintained, it becomes vulnerable, and the result of that is usually negative on performance, on security, on a lot of different things. So a good hosting company should be maintaining and monitoring the security of the site, and just the whether the site is up or not. If your site goes down, you shouldn't be the first one to know that. The hosting company should be that
Mm-hmm.
person, and they should relay that information or correct it. Caching and compression is another thing. Did you have a question? No,
Yeah, I was just going to say, if I'm a website owner, I don't have any technical knowledge. Is there anything that I would look for if I did log into my cPanel and I was just looking around, or is there something specific that I would ask my web hosting company to know how up to date everything is in my account?
That's a good question. It's often obscured from the average user's ability to see. Um, when you log into cPanel, you can often tell to some degree what's going on, especially with the database and perhaps the web server engine, what version of PHP, for example, you're running. If you know what to look for, you can get that information. Some of the lower level stuff, it's harder to see, but I think that there are red flags, and we'll touch on those. Whether or not you're getting an SSL certificate, for example, is a good sign. Whether or not your site is being backed up. Some of the things that might cause the site to be flagged. I mean, even if you log in and plugins are not, you're not able to update plugins, for example, in your site. It breaks something for some reason. That's often a good sign that something isn't quite right. So um, it may not be crystal clear, but I think you can tell typically, especially if you're trying to update things and it's just not going the way that you expect. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think that would be the best way. Um, Caching is a good thing. Compression is a good thing. Like I just said, if you go in and all of your plugins are out of date and you can't update them for some reason, um, the web hosting company and a managed hosting capacity should be coming in and cleaning that up so that you don't have to spend any time or energy figuring it out. But it could be a red flag or a sign that things are not quite up to snuff as it relates to the underlying infrastructure. And in the ability to contact people. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I have people call me or call us, and they literally had just got off hold and said, I've been waiting and waiting, and they either don't answer or they can't answer the question or resolve the problem. And
Mm-hmm.
we make a lot of effort to to be available and answer questions in a lot of different ways. So yeah, so here, red flags, right? So we just started talking about them. They are all over the place. SSL certificates are an easy one to notice if you have a website that doesn't have the little lock in the corner when you pull it up. Then that's obviously a red flag. Um, SSL certificates are important, and they are viewed by the search engines as sort of a standard that must be in place in order for your site to be sort of in the search engine's good graces. Um, the Whether or not you have nightly backups, a lot of hosting providers do not provide backups by default. You have to either set it up yourself or pay for it separate from the hosting. So it's important to know that that's happening, and if it's not, make sure that it is. You can never have too many backups. Downtime is obvious. If you, if your site is always going down, or you're the first one to know when it goes down, and then you call support to find out what's going on, and they can't help you resolve it, that's a problem. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the customer support well, being, I just kind of touched on that, being able to resolve problems, or just not being available. Um, you should always be able to get somebody on the phone, and they should always have the ability to access what needs to be accessed to get things resolved. From time to time, sites will be compromised, and we'll talk about this a little bit too as it relates to our managed hosting. Um, and when a site is compromised, typically the hosting company's immediate reaction is to turn everything off and sort of let you go. um, and that,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can understand that position, but really it's not helping anything other than them. It's not helping you as a business owner. um, so if your site is compromised or something has happened, and your web hosting company isn't willing to do anything to help you get out of that predicament other than to shut things off, that in my mind is a red flag, and is a problem. So
Mm-hmm.
um, it's important to engage the host, your host, on these things, and hopefully they're giving you the right answers. If they're not, then certainly there are others out there like Mosaic who can do that. And I think that's what separates us, frankly, from the commodity hosters that are trying to sell hosting for $3.95 or whatever, the GoDaddies of the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you just really quickly about backups. So if my hosting company does not offer backups, or if they do offer backups, but they're paid and I don't want to pay for it, I know that there are plugins and things that I can add to my site in order to back the site up. Is this something you would recommend or not?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like I said, you can't ever have too many backups. So
Mm-hmm.
the problem that people tend to run into more than anything is they'll start doing backups of their site on the web server itself, and eventually those backups become, a dead weight on the site, right? That you make a backup, it puts it into an archive. That archive is part of your web hosting environment. It's like a room in your house, right? You make a backup, you put the backup in the room of the house. Eventually that room fills up. Eventually the house fills up, and all of a sudden things are starting to break down because there's no room in the house anymore, or the apartment in this case, uh, for people to move around because the backups are taking all the space. So yes, it's important to get that done, but it's also important that it's being managed correctly. And if you're backing up, maybe every day you take one backup a week or one backup a month and move it down from the web server, and get rid of everything else. Just leave it so that there's maybe a week's worth of backups on the server, and then you take one and bring it down. And then that way you'll have every day and the last week, so effectively 14 days of recovery, that you can get from that. And that's usually good
Mm-hmm.
enough for most folks.
Do you recommend that they be stored locally on my computer, or should they be stored in the cloud, like connected to a Dropbox or Google Drive? Is there a recommended way to do it?
No, I mean, I think it's six of one, half dozen of the other. I like to have my things where I can reach them, especially backups.
Mm-hmm.
But cloud storage is so reliable now. It's very unlikely, knock wood, that anything would happen to Dropbox or anything else. But if you're backing up your computer at home, which you should be, you just put, adding the backups from your website to whatever that drive happens to be is fine. But if you're using Google Drive or OneDrive or Dropbox, and that's your primary area where I guess my answer is do what you're comfortable with, whether it's cloud-based or on your local machine somewhere, or on a drive that's hanging off your local machine. Either is going to work. You can't have too many
Mm-hmm.
of them. Either will work. You just need to know where it is so that when the time comes, if the time comes, that you
Mm-hmm.
can you can pull it and use it without any
Mm-hmm.
hassle, right?
And I think that one of the most important takeaways of this is if you have to go through all the trouble to do this yourself, then this is a major red flag, and you should maybe consider auditing your hosting company. You know, taking a look at where you are, what they have to offer, just as part of your basic plan to protect your website and to protect your investment.
That's right. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that one of the things that separates how we do things at Mosaic from the others is that we go beyond just the hosting. There are so many other things that are important to the success of a website, that if you're just doing hosting, you're missing the boat, and so that's why we do it this way. So let's see here. The most common problems related to site performance typically involve media files. Oh, you know it as well as I do. How many times have we got the call that my website is slow, or my website won't load, or something is wrong, and we open it up and there's this huge video file or a huge, high resolution photo or series of photos right on the home page, and it takes, it's not that the servers are having a problem. It's that the site is so huge that it takes forever to open, and photos aren't compressed, and videos are being served up from the site itself, and ultimately these things put such a burden on the environment that it causes things to break down. And there are many things that as a hosting provider we can do to educate both end users, the business owners and solopreneurs who are out there with their sites and happen to be doing their own development, and developers too. We have scads of designers and developers who we work with, and they don't realize the importance of compression and the importance of offloading video to third parties like YouTube or Vimeo, where it lightens the load of the website, and as the result makes it much more efficient, and the performance goes up, and everything just kind of comes back to life. And so I frankly like it when it's great when we get calls like that, and then we can go in and really help people understand why these things are impacting the site the way they do. We have tools that we use that can provide analysis, and really not only show what's going on, but also specifically say that this photo or this thing on your site is way out of proportion to what it should be, and you need to fix it. And then we'll often go through and do what we call remediation. So we'll do an audit, we'll figure out what it is about the site that's causing the problem, and then go through and fix those things. And oftentimes they have to do with imagery assets, graphical assets. And then we can also employ caching and other things, and I don't want to go too off the rails with caching, but as your business grows and you begin to have customers that are outside of your geographic area, maybe you have customers in California, and you have customers in Maryland, and you may even have customers in Europe or Canada, it becomes critical for you as a website owner to be able to serve those pages up to people no matter where they are with the same relative speed. And we can employ caching, which effectively serves these static pieces, graphical images and other things, up to a content delivery network, which then, if I'm in California, will serve the images from a much closer proximity and only bring from the main web server the dynamic information that may change from day to day. And as the result, it optimizes the performance and makes it consistent for the end user, whether they're in California or Maryland or Canada or Europe or wherever, because the network is distributing the static assets around to keep that load time from being so high that it feels like it's taking forever for the site to load, or it feels like the site frankly is broken. So the do's and don'ts, I think I've touched on. You don't want to have video directly being served from your site. You don't want to have audio that's really a no-no. Either one of them playing automatically, I think, those are just sort of, etiquette type things. And then the images, this is probably the biggest, the biggest thing where people, I mean, I even do it. Frankly, I'm guilty of it too, where, we add a new image to the site because we have a new portfolio piece or we have a new whatever slider on the homepage, hero image, and it's like, oh shoot, I forgot to compress it properly. And all of a sudden the site goes from snappy to, to slow. And it's like, oh shoot, I need to go in and optimize that image so that it doesn't drag things down. So those are important. And the alternatives are places like YouTube. We often work with people to get them set up on YouTube or Vimeo or some combination thereof. There are many tools, and we often will help folks get familiar with not only the tools that will compress the images, but also the types of compression to use. There are new forms of compression. People hear about JPEG and TIFF and PNG and this and that. Well, those are all different types of compression. And there are some compressions that are better than others because, while you want the images to be thin and easy to load, you don't want to lose the quality. You don't want it to be fuzzy, right, and choppy. So it's not only important to
Mhm.
compress the images, but compress them properly. And then the same
Mhm.
thing with audio. Audio is just like video. It's just not as heavy. So if you can serve it from somewhere else, it's just a much better situation. Um, yeah.
So, what if I have videos and audio files? I really don't want to use YouTube. I don't want to use SoundCloud or any of the options out there. It's really important for my site that I host this on my website. What are my hosting options to be able to do this in a way that it's not going to affect my site negatively, or will it always?
It will to some degree. At that point, then we get into optimization, right? Certainly a private server would probably be more in order than shared hosting. A lot of it depends on what that video is, what size it is, and how it's been compressed. We've been very successful, frankly, in streaming video from directly on a website. I mean, it's possible. It's just not the ideal. But if for whatever reason YouTube or a third party platform isn't an option, then we can absolutely do it. There are many ways to put that together. Have the front end, the head of it, like you kind of see on the sidebar with the play, pause, stop, and integrate that all together into your website directly, and have it run, perfectly fine and not affect the load of the site. It just has to be done properly, and it can't just be whipped together. Sometimes there's a plugin that you can use, but I would say plugins are dangerous in websites. Some
Mm-hmm.
of them aren't built very well. I mean, you could easily put on this slide the same thing about plugins as you would for media files, quite frankly, because
Mm-hmm.
in these WordPress sites now, I mean, plugins are a dime a dozen, and gosh, we'll open up websites and they have 55 different plugins doing one thing or nothing to benefit the website. And so you have to be careful when you're, especially in a DIY situation, about using plugins, because I get it, they solve a problem, but a lot of times the problem you're solving, it ends up creating 4 other problems that you don't even realize. And a lot of that has to do
Mm-hmm.
with just the pure performance of your site, but also the security, the vulnerabilities that exist. So
Mm-hmm.
it's always a good idea to do some research on plugins. There are plugins that help you embed and serve video, but you can't just randomly go out and pick something, throw it together, and pray. I mean, well, I guess you can, but it's generally not a good idea. And I think that's again where a hosting company like Mosaic will separate itself, because we can help give guidance, even if we may not be doing the actual turning the wrench. We can at least help
Mm-hmm.
educate someone. And that's a big part of what we do, is educating, helping the folks that we work with feel more comfortable and confident, kind of like a coach, I suppose, in what they're doing with their site, or just frankly, taking care of it, and so they can set it up and forget about it because we're dealing with
Mm-hmm.
it. So.
So if you don't mind, you've talked a lot about caching. So 2 questions. Are there any negative aspects to adding a cache plugin to my website, or?
Yes. I mean, negative, I think tricky is maybe a better word for it. Caching
Mm-hmm.
is tricky because it has to be
Mm-hmm.
done right. And oftentimes you add a caching plugin to your site, and the whole idea of caching is that it's only gonna serve up what's changed, right? So if you go and make and often, because you have caching involved in your site, you go and make a change, but the caching hasn't updated yet, and you just done something, and then you go to look at it on the internet or on the web, and it's what you've just done isn't there. And so you have to
Mm-hmm.
clear the cache in order to allow your browser to recache, or oftentimes you just have to clear the cache on your browser, because not only is the web server doing caching, and even to some degree the content delivery network, but your browser is also caching too. And we can even optimize websites in such a way that we tell the browser to cache things, to further improve the performance. So basically, caching is just eliminating the change that, or I'm sorry, it's removing the static so that only what's changed is being pushed over the wire, and therefore speeding everything up.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. So the negative parts of it are generally in the fact that you have to keep an eye on it and make sure that, if you're making changes or other things, that the cache is being cleared or being properly managed. But by and large, caching, in my opinion, is a positive thing for sure.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Uh, for caching, we talk sometimes about there are things that you can do yourself that are perfectly fine to have as a DIY, but then there are some things that really you should have a professional step in and take a look at and make sure it's set up properly. Is caching something that I could do myself successfully, or am I better reaching out to a professional to help me with this?
Boy, that's a good question. I would say probably going to a professional is the best way, at least to a degree, because you can cache images, right? You can cache script, you can cache, CSS. So there's code that can be cached and minified, made to be smaller. But that tends to get tricky, and there are plugins that will do that. Um, but I think as part of managed hosting, especially, that should be in part of it, and it is for us, and I would imagine it is for most managed hosting. Um, but that's where you can really get into the nitty gritty, the detail, with not only caching images and sort of what the most obvious things are, but also JavaScript and CSS and a lot of the other things that are sort of unseen, compressing that, minifying it, and caching it so that it's just like another level of optimization that you can bring to the table. And most DIYers are not going to get to that level. They'll get to the top level, and either do it through a plugin or maybe on their own. But it takes a little bit of understanding, professional understanding, to really take it to the next level. And that's what the managed hosting does. It takes that to the next level for sure. Oh, and here we go, managed hosting.
Mm-hmm.
So, I imagine most people are guilty of not keeping their sites up to date. If they're anything like the folks that we deal with, I'm sure some people are doing it, especially those who are more tech savvy. But by and large, people are in business to do what they do best, and while the website gets their name out there, it's not something that they're either confident with or comfortable with or even have the time to do. And therefore it goes unattended, and oftentimes it will go unattended until something breaks or is compromised, and that's when we'll get the call. and they'll ask us to, fix what's broken or resolve whatever the issue may be. And that's usually the time when the decision is made to switch from sort of the DIY, set it up and forget about it, to a more managed approach. And it's usually the expense of that downtime that justifies it, because if your website is offline, I mean, some businesses are more dependent on their website than others, and therefore they can wiggle around it a little bit. But when your website, especially in days like now with coronavirus, where people are largely doing business online, it's critical that your website is up and running and performing well, or that traffic is just going to frankly go away. Um, so putting a number on how much it costs for your site to be down or compromised, or maybe somebody's gone in and put language on there that is inappropriate or otherwise, and you don't even realize it, or the site is down and you don't even realize it, your domain name is expired and you don't even realize it, and there's all kind of little gremlins or things that can happen, and oftentimes you don't realize it until somebody calls you and says, oh, by the way, did you see that photo that's on your homepage that really shouldn't be there? Those are the things that are going to cost you, and by virtue of being proactive about managing it, much like you would with your car. Cars require attention, oil being changed, tune-ups happening. Website is the same way. I mean, the longer you let it sit and don't take care of it, the more likely it is to break, and certainly the less likely it is to run smoothly. And the same goes with the website. You may be able to set it up and get a year or two or more out of it without any, you know, real issue. But what happens when it does become a problem? Oftentimes, if it's been neglected long enough, the site will have to be rebuilt, which is an expense, or significantly um, restored. If backups are not, the worst thing is when somebody's got a site that's been compromised and then there's no backups on top of it. So there's really nowhere to retreat to, and you almost end up having to start from scratch. So managed hosting provides a lot of the safeguards, I guess is a better way to say it, to avoid all of those kinds of headaches. We make sure that the site is not vulnerable. We even put our money where our mouth is by making sure that the site can't be compromised. We monitor the site so that you're not the first one to know when it's down. We know, and we can see what it is that has made that happen and resolve it. We, there are alerts and other things that keep us in tune with that. Like I mentioned, we do a lot of things on the security front from SSL and other things to just, uh, you know, intrusion and firewall and brute force attacks. For example, with the WordPress admin, right? Anyone that has a WordPress site knows that there's an admin page to log into the site, and by default, the WordPress admin is, WP-admin, and you go there and you can log in. Well, just as a matter of sort of common sense and security, we changed that default to be something different, so that a bot that's been told to go out and find all the sort of WordPress sites that exist with standard setup, and then attack it with a set number of username, the typical admin or typical password username combinations. Can't succeed because, number one, we've changed where you have to go, so it's not something that can be easily automated. And then we can protect, keep the bot from going over and over and over again, trying to try this one, then try that one, and do that 100,000 times until it figures it out. So those are the things that we can do to mitigate that, and then
So
making updates, obviously.
how often do these attacks actually happen? If I have a WordPress website, what's the likelihood that somebody's going to actually try to break into it, that I need to have a hack-proof protection?
Well, so there's the attempt, right? And then there's the success of the attempt. So the attempts happen almost, I mean, almost immediate. I can't say immediately, but very soon after, once it figures out that your site is WordPress and it sees that you are on the sort of the standard setup and have not made any security modifications, it's going to immediately start attacking your site. And then if you have some, sort of, elementary, we'll call it for lack of a better word, username password combination, like, admin password, or, password and or whatever, change me. I mean, it's silly. And once it knows where to try and log in and there's nothing preventing it from trying, it's going to just run at it with every possible combination of username and password that it knows. And that's why you hear in the news when somebody's information has been, compromised and they've stolen all this. Well, to some degree, what's being done there is these nefarious folks are collecting username and password combinations that they can add to their database, and then their bots can go out and try and slam that information against your site until it figures it out, and then use that access to send out email, or or redirect people that come to your website to their Viagra site or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important that you put these measures in place quickly, because almost as soon as the site is up, and if Josh were here, he would attest to it, because he's the one that mainly deals with this. But he's immediately mitigating that,
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, we don't even allow people to see the site until it goes live, and then our team will go in and add these as part of the launch, add these measures to the site as part of managed hosting, and frankly, we do it just as a matter of rule, sort of a rule of thumb, but best practices would be a better way to put it. Some of these, just to avoid, because it's as bad as it is for the site owner and the site, it's bad for us too. It's bad for the server. We don't want those gremlins coming to the site and trying to attack through DDoS or something else, or denial of service.
Mm-hmm.
So
Not too long ago, whenever you set up the security, you attach an email to it. And not too long ago, I remember we had 1,000 emails, 1,000 hits coming through in a 24-hour period. I mean, the numbers are just incredible. So if I do see this, is this something that I need to worry about, or?
What do you mean? The emails are coming to your email account, or going out of the server, or?
If the emails are coming to me saying that somebody is attempting to log in, so basically it keeps hitting the login again and again and again. Mm-hmm. How many is too many? How many before I start to worry?
3.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, the fact of the matter is that if the site is set up properly, it a typical user shouldn't be able to try more than a handful of times before the firewall of the server, before the security measures start to take effect, right? Mm-hmm. With our hosting environment, typically after the 3rd or 4th or 5th time, the server is going to recognize that, and it's going to block the IP address that it's originating from. So there's some intelligence built into our security, and it'll see the IP where it's originating from, and it'll blacklist that IP, and then that IP address for the next 24 hours won't be able to access any of our servers, let alone that site. Mm-hmm. And that mitigates the risk, or eliminates the threat. Mm-hmm. However, there are times when we have customers who, mm-hmm. Oh shoot, what was my password again? And they try this one and that one and the next one, and then they're locked out, and they're like, oh crap, your site, Mosaic is down, oh my gosh. I was like, no. You just, trip the firewall, and they freak out because their site's not accessible. But if they go outside on their phone, and they can pull it right up. And anyway, so, folks call, we unlock the IP address, and then everything comes back to normal. But it's a safeguard, right? It's one of those safety measures that we put in place that most hosting companies, frankly, don't go and do. They put it on you to take care of that, and we sort of do that as a matter of best practice, and mm-hmm. It's very effective, for sure. It makes it possible for me to say that we are 100% hack proof, because between backups and the security measures that we take and other things that we do, if something does happen to your site, I am 100% guarantee you that we'll get it back to where it should be, because we've done the due diligence, we've taken the time to ensure that we're going to have what we need to make that, to put that back the way it was. And not only that, keep it from happening again, because we're going to identify what it is that caused it in the first place and stop it and not let it happen again. So that in and of itself should sell. that should
Mm-hmm.
be that should be all it takes to sell managed hosting in my mind. But it's not that easy to sell, unfortunately.
So so even though I can go in and I can make certain updates myself, I can go in and I can update my theme and I can update the core. At the end of the day, the benefit of managed hosting and the real value is all the pieces that come with it. It's not, while making these updates are a top priority, it's not the only piece that's part of managed hosting.
Oh, yeah.
Managed hosting is a whole suite of
Oh, yeah,
services
it's
that
deep.
protect your site.
Yeah, it's deep, right? It's way deeper than
Mm-hmm.
that. That's just buttons you click on the surface, and it's important, but
Mm-hmm.
that's just the surface. And then once you open the hood, there's a whole another can of worms there that you have to make sure are being managed. And if they're not, then trouble could come. It doesn't mean it's gonna. Like I said, you put the site up and the bots come, and they're going to come, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a big difference between the attempted hack and the successful hack, and the difference between the two is how smart you and we and whoever owns the site is being about thwarting that and keeping it from happening. And passwords are a big part of it. Firewalls and the ability for the server to recognize threats and block them is a big part of it. And
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, it goes a long way.
So it's for another conversation, because I know it's a bigger conversation that surrounds it, but just at a very high level, if I'm creating a new user for my WordPress site, or if I'm adding a password to my WordPress site, we want that password to be as strong as possible, right? Any recommendations on how to make the strongest possible password, but still, I mean, potentially if it can't be something I can remember, how can I make sure that it's strong enough to protect somebody from getting into my site?
My recommendation would be, at a minimum, to use 2 different words that are not related. So it's not your daughter's first name and last name. It's it's blue and car engine or whatever, or engine, and and then add at the very least a number to the end of it, if not a special character or some combination of the two.
Mm-hmm.
That will make things pretty complicated. I mean, just that is pretty good. Of course, the best thing is to just use a completely random set of characters and numbers and special characters, numbers, and uppercase, lowercase, etc. And keep those in a password manager. We've used LastPass for ages now. It's a very good tool. Most browsers will offer to remember passwords. The browser thing, I don't know. I'm not a real big fan of the browser password management systems, because they're so easy to get into. Anybody that has access to your computer can pretty much get access to them, although I think they're now password protected as well. I just haven't used them in a while. I like the idea of LastPass and OnePass, and there are a dozen of them, but LastPass is the one that I'm most familiar with, because it requires you to create and maintain one master password. And once you've done that, then everything else, you don't have to think about it. It's just there. And it will force you, or at least motivate you, to use a unique password for everything that you do. And if you install it in your web browser and you install the app on your phone, no matter what you're doing, LastPass can then offer to fill it in for you. It does it with stars. Nobody can see what it is, but you can just automate. It's more or less automated.
Mm-hmm.
And all you have to do is remember that master password, and you should make that master password as complicated as you possibly can, 20 characters of all different shapes and sizes, and then put it somewhere safe, in a safe deposit box or whatever you got to do to keep it safe. And and then you don't have to worry about it anymore. It becomes a very easy thing, and you can have, a goal of making unique especially for banking and, your website or anything of value, you should try and use unique. I can't stress that enough, even whether it's related to your website or anything.
Mm-hmm.
Just good password management. You can have a whole topic on that.
Mm-hmm. And the two additional things about LastPass is, first, it's free. The basic user edition is totally free to use, and you get a lot of features with that free version.
Yeah.
And then when you go to share your passwords, if you don't want to actually share your password, but somebody else has to log into your account for some reason, LastPass will allow you to share the password with another person, but they cannot see that password, so that they can use the information to log into whatever program or place you want them to log into, but they at no time have access to your
like
actual
your kids.
credentials.
Right. You want your kids to log into Amazon and do something, but you don't want to give them, and therefore all your neighbors, your password, because or like my Wi-Fi password. My God, I have to change that all the time because my kids are constantly giving that I have to give guests. Anyway, that's a whole nother conversation too. Kids and passwords.
So, I think we've just about reached the end. We're almost into the Q&A session. So if there are any other questions that you have, please do send them through. Jason, was there anything else that you wanted to touch on about managed hosting before we talk a little bit about the key takeaways from today's webinar?
No, I think, I think people are starting to get it. I feel like we started doing managed hosting way before it was kind of cool.
Mm-hmm.
For a long time, people didn't appreciate what hosting meant. And I think now people are starting to understand that it's more than just a place to put your website. There's a lot more to it. And hopefully I made that a little more clear for folks today.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there is a lot of value. I like good value, like anybody. I want to get, good value from the things that I spend my money on. And I feel like this is a good value. It's to some degree, it's an insurance policy, but really more than anything, it's a way to make sure that your website is running at its best all the time. And then when you layer on analytics and other things that you need to make your business thrive, it's on a solid foundation. The foundation is solid, and now all the other things that are going to come along are just going to work that much better. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that takes us right into our key takeaways, which is, choosing the right type of hosting for your website will support everything you do to create more visibility for your business online.
Yeah.
Very important.
Amen.
Your hosting company can make or break your website, 100%. Uploading videos and audios directly to your website can cause your website to slow down. Make sure that you embed them instead.
Yeah, I would also add plugins, and I touched on it in our talk, but plugins are death to sites too a lot of times.
Mm-hmm. Is there, and then the last one is updating your website is critical to its health and security, protect your investment, and allow your site to be managed. But going back to plugins just really quickly, is there anything specific if I need an additional functionality and I'm looking around for a plugin, anything specific that you would recommend to look for? Should I always look for a premium plugin? Is that necessary? Can I work with what's in WordPress already, or
Right.
How do I figure that out?
Well, it's a little bit of common sense, but it'll get you a long way. Number one, look and see which plugins are being downloaded the most, because obviously if something has been downloaded 10 million times, it's probably good and on the up and up, and that's a good thing. You may not have to pay for it, but it's okay, because whatever they're doing is drawn masses, and the masses will take care of it because they have an audience. If it's not so commonly downloaded, and then typically it's best to go premium, because at the end of the day, whoever's doing this work should be compensated. It's only fair. The benefit of plugins, and frankly WordPress in general, is that you're leveraging the development exercise, the effort that goes into it across the community. And so rather than you having to pay $1,000 or $10,000 for somebody to build a feature that goes into your website, you're asking this developer to do it for everybody, and so you pay them $10 or $100 a year or whatever. But it keeps them not only does it get you what you need, but it keeps them motivated to keep it up to date. So so yeah, you have to pay. It's not free, but you know what? The guy's doing work, or whoever it is doing the work. So, and you're paying a fraction of what you would have to pay otherwise. So why not? It is a good idea to use premium plugins for that reason specifically. A lot of the freemium stuff is good, but there's a catch. There's a catch of some kind. Either they're going to stick it to you with ads, or they're going to do this, or they're going to do that. And most of the time they're just not worth the headache, I would say. And that goes with themes too. Yeah, you can find some good themes that are free, and you don't have to worry about paying an annual fee to the developer or designer. But, as WordPress evolves, I've seen this a lot of times. As WordPress evolves, the free themes get left behind in the dust, and now you've got a site that's sort of locked into the XYZ version of WordPress when there's all these new things that have come out, and we have to, basically rebuild the site in order to upgrade it. So, and then instead of it being, whatever, $50 or $100 a year, you're talking about another $5,000 or $6,000 to have a site. So how many years is that for, to have it rebuilt and done in a way that you can maintain it over time? So it's a small price to pay for the longevity that you should get from it.
And it's just as frustrating for us when when that happens with a client. If their site goes down, we're not able to help them repair. We're not able to do anything other than recommend that they rebuild it.
Yeah, they're stuck.
It's very frustrating for us as well.
Yeah, they get stuck. We see it all the time. People are stuck, and then there's a lot of ways to get stuck in this business, unfortunately. And I think that's another thing that at least I pride and I think we all do. I can't just me, our team. It's about seeing the forest through the trees, right? And telling somebody, hey, whether you choose to use us or not, here's something that you need to watch out for. And and people appreciate that, so it's good. That's what I like to bring to the table, is that, education, the coaching aspect of it, I suppose, coaching people up.
Aside from everything else, that's what we do best.
That's right.
Yeah.
I'm a coach.
So are we ready to start the Q&A now? We have a couple of really good questions here. So is it correct to assume that a private hosting has its own physical server? If so, how big are these servers, and how do you deal with adding more and more space? Do you have to extend the building in order to expand the space, or how exactly does that work?
Wow. Well, that's certainly somebody who's been around a bit. So private servers are generally dedicated resources, yes. And, with virtual, I don't know how far in the weeds I want to take this answer, but there are a lot of ways to provision it. So, assuming that this is somebody who knows technical stuff, because it's a pretty technical question, we add virtualization layers to what we do. And that virtualization layer allows us to provision servers in a way where we can scale them fairly quickly. You'll also hear about container systems. Containerized systems and virtualized systems are very similar. Containers are more application specific, and virtualization is more server oriented. But I guess the short answer is yes, I should say private server is typically virtualized, and virtualization allows us to scale resources, whether it's compute, RAM, or storage, as required by the site or the application that's on it, making it very easy. Very efficient, I guess is the better word for it, for us to add the resources as they need to add them, and bandwidth too, for that matter. Does that answer it?
I believe I believe so. I didn't see
Yeah.
a follow-up question just
Okay.
yet. Next question: when you're in shared hosting, is it true that your website can be attacked or affected by other websites?
Oh, yeah. So, yes, it is possible, and one of the safeguards that we put in place, and not all hosting companies do this, but it's very important, is a mechanism by which we can isolate sites from one another. So while you're sharing, it's like the lock on the door of your apartment, right? While you're sharing the the building, right? We can isolate each site so that no one neighbor can take down the whole building, right? So it's very important in shared hosting that that's happening. I would say most hosting companies that are doing things right are doing it that way, but it doesn't mean that they all are. And it's certainly probably something we should have put in the red flags. But yeah, it's important that you ask at the very least, if they don't put it out there already, whether or not your shared hosting account can be isolated from or protected from your neighbor, uh, you know, compromising it, or even just taking the whole server down where they're all of a sudden using all the resources. And again, it goes to that our intelligence component of the security, where I can see that a site is being attacked by some bot or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and the server recognizes it, shuts it down, and protects everyone from the enemy of this one particular tenant.
Mm-hmm. Right, well, that's really good information. That was a
Yeah.
good question.
Yep.
So the next one is about image compression. So is an image compressor typically a plugin in a WordPress site? Do you set it up to compress all the images, or do you have the option of compressing each image manually if it is a plugin that you would add?
Dimitri would answer this question
And
better than me, but I
I
think,
have an answer for this too.
okay, yeah, okay, because I'm thinking, yes, there are plugins that will do this very well. Smush,
Mm-hmm,
I think, is one of them.
mm-hmm,
But I tend to like using Photoshop, frankly, to do it.
mm-hmm.
And there are SCAD, and like you probably know better than me what the sort of the fruit of the day as it relates to image compression.
Mm-hmm.
But so go ahead if you have something.
There are a couple really strong websites out there that do this for you. So you can upload one image or you can upload multiple images, and then it provides an automatic compression, and it shows you the quality between the before and after, so you can make sure that it does look, typically it looks exactly the same, but it compresses it between 40 and 60%. If for whatever reason you need more or less compression, you can do this manually. So Image Optimizer is a really good one. There's a number of them that are really good out there. But instead of using a plugin, I definitely recommend optimizing the images before you upload them to WordPress. Smush is a really good one, but it's not as effective as doing it prior. It does compress it a
I
fairly
agree.
good amount, but I've noticed that when you use plugins, typically if you were to check your website before and after using the plugin, you don't see nearly as much of a difference as you do if you if you replace some of the images with previously compressed images.
Yeah.
It makes a big
And a
difference.
lot of times Google PageSpeed will still alarm on the same. So
Mm-hmm.
it alarms you about an image, and then you go and use Smush to compress it, and it'll still alarm you about the same exact image. It knows just as well that you took the easy way out, and
Mm-hmm.
it's just the alarm keeps going off. The other thing about plugins that I didn't say before, and it kind of relates to this, is when you're done using a plugin, get rid of it. There's no reason if you install, I mean, we just said don't do this for image compression, but if you installed a plugin with the sole purpose of compressing an image, and then you're done compressing the image, get rid of the plugin. It doesn't need to be on the site. It's just adding bloat to your site for no good reason. So, and it
Mm-hmm.
could be any plugin, whether it's image compression or whatever.
So the next one is a really good question, and it's how do you prevent spam emails for websites with email message forms? So This is actually part of a much bigger
Yeah,
conversation that we'll
right.
cover in the future, yes. And there is a follow-up to that question. So is if you are receiving a lot of spam emails, is it a sign of not being secure?
Yes, but it's more a sign of things not being configured correctly, I would say. Um, so CAPTCHA, I mean, everybody's familiar with CAPTCHA, I think now, where you have to click the, the box that I'm not a robot, or you have to choose the images in order to complete the form. That has been a very effective tool for eliminating spam, from entering the site. But then, if somebody has managed to pass spam through your site, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're using the form. They're just using the server's engine for mail with your credentials as the conduit. And this will often happen when a plugin or something is vulnerable to injection, like a SQL injection or something else that will allow the attacker to put a piece of code on your site. So oftentimes when this is happening, it's a sign that the site has been hacked, obviously. And then we can go in and often find a piece of code that's been injected into the site as the result of a poorly built plugin or something that's out of date. And then that code that gets injected into the site is used to pass email through your site as if it was being filled out in a form, when it really has nothing to do with your form. It's this little script that managed to get into your site, and it's doing all this crazy stuff. Again, the servers are typically, at least in our case, um, they're sensitive enough and intelligent enough to recognize when something like this is going on. And for example, we'll allow a couple hundred emails an hour generally to go through the server before things start to get locked down.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times these spammers are smart and they'll do it in a more systematic way, but a lot of times they'll just plow 10,000 mails out or whatever, 1,000
Mm-hmm.
mails an hour out. And then it's pretty clear that the site has got a problem. So that would be how it is related to, that's generally how things go as it relates to the site. Oftentimes too with WordPress, if you forget to turn off the ability for people to leave comments on pages, that will invite spammers to post things that you don't want. So you have
Mm-hmm.
to do a little bit of admin on that. And again, it goes to managed hosting. Part of the managed hosting process is to go in and make sure that those loopholes are closed, and the scammers and spammers of the world can't, post their Viagra ads on your comments section of your website.
So how, if I am receiving spam emails or I am receiving spam contact, how many is too many? You mentioned 100, you mentioned 1,000. What if it's just a couple? If it's 3 or 4 or 5 and it's not all at one time, it's over a period of time,
Yeah.
like a week or 2 weeks?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing you can do about that. There are some things that we can do from a DNS standpoint to add
Mm-hmm.
keys and SPF records to authenticate things. But as it relates to just somebody coming in, we deal with it. It happens even for us,
Mm-hmm.
and we
Yep.
do everything we can do to avoid it. It will happen. I can't say that you can stop it 100% of the time, but certainly if you're getting upwards of I don't know, 5 or more a day, I would say it's probably something. But even that isn't necessarily
Mm-hmm.
unheard of, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
certainly 10, 20, 30 regularly every day, there's usually some pattern to it too. That's another sign. If it's random, then it's probably nothing. If there's a pattern that you can see over a week or a couple of days, then there's usually something more to it.
Okay. All right. That's really helpful.
Yeah.
So I think we're at the very last question, and this is it's a good question, and it's, does Mosaic provide free SSL and backups with every hosting plan or just specific hosting plans?
Everyone, whether it's the DIY, what I call our standard DIY hosting, or managed for sure. Every site now gets an SSL certificate and gets a nightly backup. I believe we keep our backups for a week at a time. So, you have to recognize the damage. You got to pay attention. You can't have something happen to your site and then, 2 weeks or a month or whatever, come back and say, oh, can I put it back the way it was 2 months ago? So there's some limitation on that. But generally, and I've been doing this a long time, that's that. If something happens, we're going to notice it. Like I said, we are alerted to the fact if a site goes down. Where it gets tricky is if someone on your team goes in and makes an update, right? And they put the wrong page up, or they delete something accidentally, and you don't realize it, and now it's 2 weeks later, and it's like, oh crap, the blog that I spent all day on is not there. How did it, where did it go? And now we have to go and try and find it in the data, in the backups. And if too much time has passed, then that may not be possible. But most people recognize that within a week. I have to ask Josh. I think it's a week. Maybe it's 14 days. But all I can say is the amount of time that we're keeping backups, we almost never have a problem with somebody deleting something inadvertently and then needing it put back, and we can't do it. So it's good. It's a proven amount of time. Oh, there's Josh. He must be listening. He says it's 2 weeks. All right. Good answer, Josh.
Awesome. Well, so we've reached the end of our questions, and I want to thank you again for coming on and talking us through it.
My pleasure.
Different questions that we had, and thank you to everybody who listened through and asked questions and participated. It's really appreciated. It helps us better. It helps us learn also what the questions are to better answer them for you.
Yeah. Challenge us. Bring us your hosting. Try us out. See the difference. The Pepsi challenge.
So please join us in 2 weeks for our next webinar. We'll be talking about a little bit about email marketing and about adding email subscribers through your website. So that should be exciting as well.
Excellent.
And everybody have a great weekend.
Yeah, Friday.
Thank you for joining.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.